Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Great to have you here with us at the International Transport Forum's Ask the Author series. We have short meetings of 30 minutes to bring to you just the gist of the reports that we've recently published. And today our topic is water transport employment in Europe. So we're taking a look at the ocean economy, as we call it. 90% of global goods trade is happening on the high seas, and the men and women who make this happen are truly the critical workers, as we realized during the pandemic. And without them, probably many of us would still be waiting for their fridge or for their car. And it's not just the seafarers that we think of on the big container ships. It's also a lot of other roles that are linked to this activity that are part of what's also known as the blue economy. They include port services, inland waterway transport, and some others that we maybe don't think of so often. So not only are these workers critical, they're also a bigger number than we might think. And the skill set that is required to get goods from one part of the world to the other is actually quite broad and large. So how can governments set the parameters, the right parameters to ensure that water transport industry can draw on well-trained workers? Are they doing the right things? This is the topic of the report that was authored by my colleague Olaf Merk, who's with us and to whom I'll hand over in just a very short second. Let me tell you quickly a few rules of the game here at Ask the Author. So you can submit questions at any time, even now, even during the presentation, via the Q&A function at the bottom. Please don't use the chat, use the Q&A function. And after Olaf's short presentation, we will then address those, and we'll try to make sure that the majority of time of this meeting is devoted to those questions. Also, don't be surprised if at the end or towards the end of the session, you'll see a short Q&A with two questions, only two questions popping up in your window. We'd really like to know whether this is useful for you or not, and to improve how we do things for you. But without further ado, as moderators usually say, let me hand over to my colleague, Olaf Merk. There he is. Hello, Olaf. Great to see you and have you with us. Who's authored this study, which is focusing on Europe, it needs to be said, but probably there are lessons for other parts of the world as well. Olaf, tell me and tell us what is in your report on water transport employment in Europe.
Yes, many thanks for that introduction, Michael, and good afternoon to all of you. Of course, it's my pleasure to provide briefly the key messages of this new report that is called Water Transport Employment in Europe, the Role of Governance. What's in the report? What is the idea of the report? Well, first, to assess the current state of water transport employment, we talk about the governance of water transport, and we make the link between the two. Essentially, to examine what are the incoherences in government policies, and of course, at the end, we provide recommendations for reform, recommendations to ensure that the skills that are relevant to water transport occupations can be maintained. So that is the idea of the report. It was a report that was made possible by the support of the European Transport Workers Federation, that also was so kind to organize several workshops for us where we discussed about a lot of these issues. And of course, a special thanks to Estelle Brentnau and also Bernardina Tomasi, who I think are also participating in this call. Okay, so what did we find? First message, when we tried to look at what is the state of water transport employment, is that the data that are available are actually quite patchy. There are data, this graph is an example of that, but essentially if you ask the question, so how many European seafarers are there, so seafarers with EU nationality, it would be very difficult to give an answer to that question, because we haven't been able to find any data. So what you see here, for example, is data that look at the employment in European companies. But of course, European companies can also employ a lot of non-Europeans. So that is one key message that's related to employment data. Second is about labor costs. The cost of labor, they make up a considerable share of the operational costs in a lot of different water transport sectors. Generally, this is between 35 to 50% of the operational costs. Here is our estimate for the different water transport sectors that we looked at in our report. So that is shipping, that is port terminals, that is the towage sector. So that is towing ships from outside the port into the port, the inland waterway transport sector, and fisheries. Of course, there is quite a range because, of course, it depends on the different subsectors, it depends on different sorts of companies. We also looked at the labor conditions in the water transport sectors. We looked at 6 different indicators. I'll not show all of them here. Maybe if we have a little bit more time, I can show a little bit more of this work. This is a graph that looks at the number of the so-called very serious casualties happening in the shipping sector. Well, this graph shows you kind of a mixed picture. If you look at all the other indicators, you see that there is an improvement in some areas, but there's also actually a decline in some others. We tried to link let's say these observations on data, on labor costs, and also on the quality of labor to the governance and policies that are in place. And we focused indeed on Europe. And what our assessment entails is that maritime transport policies in Europe, they can be interpreted as an attempt to adapt to one big, let's say, development that happens several decades ago, and that is the emergence of the so-called open shipping registers. What that means is that ships no longer register their ships where their owners are located. So in the case of Europe, European ship owners in many cases do not register their ship in Europe, but can actually register it in another place. So in many cases, that is faraway places like Panama, like Liberia, and Marshall Islands. And some of these open shipping registries are also called flags of convenience because they are, in a way, very convenient for their for their owners, the ship owners, because they provide them with very lenient tax regimes, but also because there's not a lot of regulation that they have to enforce. So that is the big development to which Europe had to react. And they did so in 2 different ways. One is with state aid, so essentially trying to copy some of the favorable tax regimes of others. The example of that is the tonnage tax scheme. That is specific tax for the shipping sector. And another measure is the second shipping registries, which is shipping registries that are European, but that have different conditions and that are called well, international or second registries in Europe. And there is a link with our subject, with employment, because the maritime state aid, the maritime subsidies often suppose that it helps seafarer employment. But our study and also previous studies that we did show that there's actually few indications that employment effects have materialized. A few words on the flags of convenience. Essentially, by looking at this picture, what you see here is well, is 2 things. The first thing is, let's say, the overall decline of the EU flags, of the flags of EU states. So as you can see in 1980, around, well, almost 35% of the global fleet was under the EU flags or on the flags of EU states. In 2018, well, and even looking further, we see that this is a little bit more than 15%. So there's been a huge decline there. At the same time, the EU ship owners, so the ship owners that are based in Europe, they still make up around 35% of the global fleet. So what's happening is that almost half of their fleet is actually registered somewhere else than in Europe. And a considerable part of that is in the flags of convenience. So that's the first thing you can see from this slide. The second is that within Europe, there are actually also a few flags, two in particular, that have emerged. That is the flag of Malta and the flag of Cyprus. And what is interesting here is that these two flags are considered and are declared by the International Transport Workers Federation as a flag of convenience itself. So Europe has essentially to face two challenges. The first is let's say the open registries from elsewhere, but within Europe there's now also flags that are considered to be flags of convenience. As I mentioned, a policy reaction was the second registries, and what is characteristic of those is that they give fewer restrictions, so they're more attractive to ship owners. What this does, of course, is that it makes these registries also resemble more like open registries elsewhere in Europe. And that means sometimes, of course, also that it has effect on the employment. Can have an effect on crew costs, can have an effect on requirements on regulation, and it can also mean that in many cases there are fewer requirements for nationality when it comes to seafarers. Maritime state aid, that was the second policy reaction, and as I mentioned, it often supposes that the state aid is helping to support seafarer employment. For example, the tonnage tax has this as a justification. It says, well, one of the reasons to have a tonnage tax is also to support seafarer employment in Europe. And as I mentioned, there's few indications that these effects have actually been realized. And we think this is essentially because of three different things. The first is that the maritime state aid often is not directly linked to conditions for employment. So in many cases, a certain aid is given, but there's no condition for employment. The second is that there is state aid that is linked to flags. So for example, the tonnage tax, there is some sort of a requirement related to national flags or to EU flags. But there's no direct link between the national flag and the employment. This is often a very weak link. So it doesn't mean that if you have, let's say, a ship with a German flag, that means you will have a lot of German seafarers. And the third reason is that there are, as I said, now second registries. So let's say the International Registry of Denmark, but there are many of these in other countries as well. But these are also eligible for state aid in Europe. So this is, let's say, our analysis of what you could say the incoherences of the policies in Europe when it comes to policy reactions that lead to not altogether very clear incentives for maritime and water transport employment in Europe. So what are our recommendations to improve that? Well, the first is kind of a generic recommendation to make sure that the existing policy frameworks support development of the maritime skills. The second recommendation is about the data issue that we mentioned. So to improve the statistics and, for example, to start collect data on what are actually the seafarers with EU nationality. The third recommendation is about the link between ships and a state, and to ensure that there is some sort of a genuine link between the two. That is part of the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, and if that would be enforced, that could improve the safety and labor standards in the maritime sector. The fourth recommendation is to link maritime state aid more directly to the maritime transport employment. That could be done in several different ways. We made a few examples here where you could think of more conditions related to education for seafarers, for example, or to provide state aid only when ships have a certain share of EU seafarers, etc. And our final recommendation is to limit the eligibility for state aid of ships that are registered in second shipping registries or flags of convenience. So that could in a way be trying to focus the state aid really on the ships that are in shipping registries, where it is sure that there's also some sort of a positive employment effect for EU seafarers and their skills. So these are the 5 recommendations based on our report. Of course, happy to say more about this and answer any questions that you would have on this report.
Thank you so much, Olaf. This was really, really interesting, and the report is really good. I really enjoyed reading it. It's it's unfortunately maybe a bit of a niche topic, but it's really relates for everyone. It relates to everyone of us at the end of the day, if we buy iPhones or whatever that comes from far away. If you have questions, now is the time to enter them into the Q&A. Not in the chat, please, in the Q&A, because then I can manage them more easily. As there's nothing in there yet, I have the privilege of and the opportunity to ask my own first question, which I always enjoy and like. I would follow up a little bit on the question on data, Olaf. And I cannot really understand how is it that we don't know how many European nationals are serving on European ships? I mean, what is the process of data collection? Is this too expensive? Do the companies do not want to share this? What are the issues behind this very strange fact that we don't have hard data yet?
Yes, thank you, Michael. That's a really good question. I can only speculate on the answer, but I think one of the possible elements of an answer would be that this is probably related to the fact that when it comes to seafarers, this is a really global market. So a lot of let's say, the employment that is on ships is sourced from a lot of different other countries. And a lot of these are non-European countries. And some of them also probably don't really collect data on numbers. So what we have seen is that there are different data collections, but a lot of them are trying to estimate, in a way, the numbers of employment based on some sort of a proxy. So what I showed in my presentation is the data from Eurostat. So what their approach is to say what is the employment in a sector in companies that are based in Europe. When you talk about sea and coastal transport, of course, that is a tricky one, because that means that you can have, let's say, a French shipping company that will feature in these Eurostat statistics that has employment in their sector, but a lot of that could actually be seafarers from the Philippines. So they would show up in that number that I showed. There are some other statistics, for example, from the European Maritime Safety Agency that I have in another slide. Maybe can show you that as well. They have a different approach. They look at the certificates of competence that are given out by the different authorities, so also by European authorities. And so that is a way also to look at it, and that also gives you some sort of an approximation of where the EU employment in seafarers would be. So that is the second graph on this picture. But also there are, let's say, difficulties, because you actually do not really know if these are seafarers that are active. And also some of these certificates, they're also given out to to non-EU seafarers. So again, there you have the same problem. But that doesn't mean that this is not a problem that couldn't be solved. I think it is essential to solve it, because if your policy goals are related to, let's say, maritime employment and the number of seafarers, and if you consider this to be a strategic sector, which Europe seems to consider, then of course it is essential also to be able to measure it.
Thanks, Olaf. I would have a couple of follow-up questions on that, but we can't just talk about data. And I want to relay the question from Estelle, that is about the linkages between the different sectors in water transport. I read the word waterborne here. I love it. Waterborne employment. I always see people walking over the water. So where are the synergies? Where are the trade-offs? How are the sectors linked, and what does it mean?
Yes, thank you very much. And of course, I'd like to salute Estelle, because she is really at, let's say, the basis of this study, and without her support, I think this report wouldn't have been possible. And of course, our question is also asking exactly about the things that are in the report, but that I didn't really mention in my presentation. Yes, you're right. There is, let's say, a chapter in this report that is looking at the linkages between the different water transport sectors. So, as I mentioned briefly before, what we looked at is the shipping sector. We looked at ports, port terminals. We looked at the towage sector as one of the port services. We looked at inland water transport, and we looked at fisheries. And of course, the question that was asked, and that we also try to answer, is what are the links between those? Are there synergies to be discovered? We try to do that in several ways. So what we looked at is, well, first let's say the backward and the forward linkages. That is an economic term, but essentially what it means is, are there any, let's say, clients or providers relations between different sectors? We looked at spatial relations. So are the places where these different sectors operate from, are these the same? So are, let's say, the ports where shipping companies go to, are these the same ports as the ones that are used by the fishery sector, for example? And there is a third way of looking at the interlinkages, where we looked at the vertical integration between sectors. So that is the shipping sector, let's say, integrated with the port sector or not? And that for all the different sectors. So what we discovered when making this analysis is that there are a few of these sectors that are really very interlinked. That is, for example, especially the case when it comes to container shipping, container terminals. It is to a lesser extent the case between shipping, ports, and inland water transport, because that is really also different sector with different inland ports and also with different shipping companies in many cases. And the links with the fisheries sector are generally, well,
Can I interject? Why did you include fisheries? Because that seems to be sort of slightly, I mean, that fish are also transported after they're caught, but it seems a little bit odd. For me, as a reader, it was a little bit odd that fisheries were included here.
Yeah, so that was also what, in a way, came out of that that analysis of the interlinkage. So that is a sector that really is a bit apart, but it was considered to be a sector in many discussions. Also, when you talk about the ocean sector, and when you talk about water transport, of course, there's always also an idea to look at fisheries as well.
When you think of fisheries, sorry.
No, go ahead.
When you think of fisheries, you think of labor conditions and of the statistics of the very critical accidents that you mentioned. I can imagine that a lot of them happen in fisheries. I was interested to see that in the statistics, kind of, you have a strong decline in serious accidents, I think, from the 1950s to the 2000s, but then it's kind of leveling off, which is a little bit what happens in traffic on roads as well, that there is kind of a plateauing. What are the reasons for that? Can that be described? What's behind that?
Yes, I can show the graph that you referred to, so that the people that are listening and looking at it can also see it. If I manage to get this moving. I think this is the graph that you refer to. So it looks at the crew fatalities per seafarer year. So that is the unit. It has taken, well, let's say, all the numbers that exist in the different studies for different countries, for different fleets. And indeed, what you can see is that the number of crew fatalities, so also the safety on board, has certainly increased. So the safety has increased, and the crew fatalities have decreased since the 1950s. So you see the trend is clearly there, and that has halted more or less, has stabilized more or less over the last decades. The reason why I used, let's say, the studies from the different countries, because that makes it in a way a little bit more comparable. So you can compare, let's say, the different, same colors and see how that develops over time. So you see more or less similar trends in different countries over that period. So why has that happened? I think because there has been a lot of regulation at the international level that has been enforced when it comes to the safety of ships. I think the IMO has been successful in regulating that. This has been enforced in a lot of different countries, and that, of course, has had an effect. Now we are, I think, at a point where it probably is difficult to do even better, so to go down even better, unless you come up with a lot more stringent safety regulations. But I don't think that is really in the cards.
Vision Zero enforced by IMO.
Yeah.
Interesting. We're reaching the end of the limit. We can extend a little bit if there are further questions. The intention of these short sort of snapshots is never to tell the whole story. It's to motivate you to go to the report, have a look at the report, to share the video, which will be on YouTube afterwards, with colleagues and friends, discuss this, and get in touch with us, get in touch with Olaf, with people at ITF, to start a conversation about this and how to improve things, how to make sure that we have the right people, the well-trained people, the well-motivated people who are working on ships and ports and so on and so forth. One interesting statistics, just maybe to wrap this up a little bit, unless I see questions popping up, is that the number of cadets who actually join the workforce, as potentially senior officers on ships, is declining in Europe. So if we extrapolate and look forward to 10 years, it might be even worse than better, unless we do something now. So some work to do for governments to set the right parameters, and for the industry maybe to share a little more data. I don't know, they probably have data that Eurostat doesn't possess. Unless, oh, there's a thank you in the question. Thank you very much. Thank you. This is not the final opportunity to ask questions. You can send them to us by email or just give us a call, and we'll be very, very happy to chat about this topic and develop this further. It's not just a flash in the pan. It should be, a conversation and something that then leads to some policy impact maybe in the long run. It never happens the next day, but sometime down the road it may well. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Olaf, for your excellent presentation. And you will now see the poll popping up in your window. And if you could answer those 2 questions, it would really help us to get some stats on whether we're doing the right thing or not. Everybody, thank you so much. It was great to have you. And we hope to see you again at the next Ask the Author on a different topic, but it might still be of interest to you. I will share with you by email the video link to the YouTube recording of the session. So if you know people who couldn't make it, but who might be interested, you can share that. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Olaf, and have a very good day wherever you are. Thanks, bye.